My grandma always told us stories about a man who disappeared like smoke. My great-grandfather, Charles, or as I like to call him, Grandpa Charlie. Charlie was part myth, part cautionary tale. She said he was a gambler, the kind who carried bags of money and trouble in equal measure. He was always looking over his shoulder as if someone was after him. And one day, he just didn't come back. As a kid, I didn't ask questions. He was a ghost nobody could bury and one that nobody could find. This is the story of my search for my great-grandfather. This is the Finding Grandpa Charlie podcast. Last week, we opened with the case file on Grandpa Charlie. We opened it up. We followed broken family stories, trying to pull facts out of half-whispered memories. He was rumored to have died under a train, but there was no death certificate, no grave, nothing but a scrap of clothing, some belt buckles, and a visit from strangers. His wife, Henrietta, called the money that he brought home filthy lucre, and after that, he vanished. And so the mystery begins. Not just to find out when Charlie died, but whether he ever really existed. But before we can follow the man who disappeared, we have to understand where he came from. Even though Charlie was born in Fannin County, Texas, he didn't grow up living there. He left with his family as a child, a household always chasing new farmland, new luck, or just a way to stay ahead of bad times. Still, at some point, Charlie came back, and that's where we start our story today, in a town that, admittedly, I've never been to, but one that I now know better than some places I've lived. Bonham, Texas. Now, if you visit it today, you'll find a grand courthouse that looks like it was plucked straight from a Western. Towering, regal, something straight out of the 1800s. But that's the thing. It didn't always look that way. Back in the 1900s, the town actually remodeled the courthouse to look more modern. The tower was gone, the roofline flattened, and they covered up all that beautiful age charm. But just a few years ago, they restored it. They peeled off that 20th century facade and all the updates and rebuilt the original spire. The courthouse you see today looks very much like the one that Charlie likely walked past, maybe even walked into. Elsewhere in town, there's a local winery, a creative arts center inside an old church, murals painted on old brick. Bonham today is a mix of quiet charm and living memory, a place that still holds on to its story. But in Charlie's day, it was probably just dust and timber, cotton bales, saddles and wagons, slow trains pulling out of the depot. A town full of movement, and men like Charlie rarely stayed put. Still, for a short time, he came home. Maybe for family. Maybe for love. Maybe for who knows. Maybe because, even the restless get tired sometimes. If you want to understand where Charlie came from, really understand it, you have to go back to Bonham, Texas in the year 1888. Luckily for us, someone at the time had the good sense to write it all down. The Bonham News Annual. You can find it online, published in 1888. It gives us a rare and vivid glimpse into what the town looked like, sounded like, and felt like. It's part local newspaper, part civic brag book, and part time capsule. And it's a gift for anyone like me trying to piece together a life from the fragments of time. Bonham in 1888 was not a sleepy town. They called it the prettiest and most substantial town in North Texas. And they weren't just being poetic. The courthouse anchored the square, surrounded by 2-story brick buildings with balconies and arched windows. Hitching posts likely lined the streets. Wooden sidewalks probably clicked and clacked beneath boots and maybe hooves. It was a town with 4 rail lines, tons of churches, dozens of businesses, and at least 3 photography studios, which in 1888 meant that people here weren't just surviving on the edge of the old American West. No, the West was dying. It was in its death throes in the late 1800s. The 20th century was on the horizon. Soon, telephone lines would be implemented, and modern technology and media as we now know it would evolve. But in 1888, they had none of that, but they had photography. They were posing. They were saving memories. They were investing in the future, and they were dreaming. The Bonham News Annual boasts of commerce, like cotton, dry goods, lots of grocers being shipped out across the region. You can almost hear the pride in their voice when they write about their banks, their schools, their mills, and the gas lamps lighting up the town square at night. But behind all the polish, well, you still had the dust and the deals, the saloons, the blacksmiths, the drummers peddling patent medicines. This was a real town, alive and a little rough around the edges. This is the Bonham that Charlie Henderson was born into. He worked the land during the week and preached the gospel on Sunday. That's what an old book says about him, a county history printed decades ago, but still in copyright. It's one of the few places that even mentions him. They called him Reverend Robert Pickens Henderson. He was my great-great-great-grandfather. Charlie's grandfather, and from everything I can gather, he didn't just settle in Fannin County. No, he planted roots so deep they nearly swallowed him whole. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind past Charlie, past his father, Robert A., to a time before Bonham had paved streets or a proper depot. Somewhere in the early 60s, the Hendersons came to Texas. Not from the east, but from the southeast. From Alabama, where the Reverend had been living and most likely preaching. And before that, well, he was born in Tennessee. By the time he arrived in Texas, he had a family, a calling, and, if you believe the stories, a rifle close by to fend off the occasional Comanche raid. He built a life near a town that I think is called Gober, Gober, a tiny dot on the map just southwest of Bonham. He was the kind of man who spent the summers under trees leading revival meetings and the winters with his hands in the dirt. And in 1870, the census caught a snapshot of his world, a ledger recording the farms of individuals living in the area. It records 50 acres tilled, 50 acres unimproved, $1,600 farm value with 2 horses, 6 cows, 4 pigs, a preacher, yes, but also a working man with mouths to feed. This is the world Charlie was born into, if he didn't stay in it long. But before we talk more about Charlie, we have to talk about the problem. The one that every genealogist absolutely dreads. Too many people with the same freaking name. You see, there are 3 Robert Hendersons tangled up in this story. Charlie's father, Robert A. Henderson, the restless one, the one who moved around a lot, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Charlie's grandfather, the Reverend Robert Pickens Henderson, the one who rooted himself in Fannin County and never left. And Charlie's great-grandfather, who was also called Robert Pickens Henderson, also simply referred to as Robert P. Henderson Esquire, the one who died in Ladonia in 1869. Sorting them out in the records, it's a mess. One shows up in the census, another one in a land deed, a third in a burial record, and sometimes it's the right one, sometimes it's not, and they're all called Robert Henderson. But if we set aside the paperwork and the dust and the sweat of searching through it all and just listen to the land, a picture starts to form. Reverend Robert Henderson stayed. The Reverend built a homestead and, from what I read, a church. He lived long enough for Charlie to know him, to walk beside him on that Fannin County soil. And when Charlie came back to Bonham around 1900, he may have done what so many men do when life gets messy. He went home to Grandpa. The same home and the same land, very likely, that Charlie was born to is the land he came back to in 1898. If you want to understand where Charlie came from, really understand it, you have to go back to Bonham, Texas, in the year 1888. And we talked about it earlier, and by this time, Charlie was moving around with his family. By the time Charlie shows up in the 1900 census, he's 20 years old, living once again in Fannin County, Texas, and not just living there, he's listed as the head of household, married, independent, settled. But at the exact same time, in a different part of the state, Stonewall County, Texas, Charlie shows up again. This time he's listed by his father, still living in home, single, dependent, still a boy. That's not a clerical mix-up. That's something else. 2 census entries, 2 counties, 2 versions of the same man. One starting a new life, one pretending that the one never ended. This is the first hard evidence we have that Charlie might have been living a double life, or at the very least, splitting himself between what was expected of him and what he actually chose. And if you're listening closely, that echo, that tension between truth and fiction, that split, it doesn't go away. It only gets louder. Let's rewind again. Charlie, we know, was born in Fannin County, but he didn't stay long. His childhood was a string of new counties, new farms, and new starts. Greenville County, Anson, Stonewall County. Wherever his father went, young Charlie would naturally follow until sometime around 1898 when he came back to Fannin County, back to the land where his family had once put down roots. But here's the thing. The Reverend Robert Henderson, Charlie's grandfather and grandmother, well, they weren't living on the old farm anymore, so far as I can tell. In the 1900 census, the Reverend is listed in the household of his daughter and son-in-law. He's aging, slowing down, maybe even ill. The possibilities are endless. That home may have been the only stability Charlie had ever known, and it was fading fast. And it's here, sometime around the turn of the 20th century, that Charlie meets Henrietta. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, there are no early records on Henrietta. Not that I have found. Not yet. Not of her birth or her arrival in Texas, her parents, her family. One of her parents was said to be Native American. The other was from the United States, and she was born in Indian Territory, which we now know as Oklahoma. Indian, a word that we don't use to refer to Native Americans as anymore. The only records that we have, well, they come later. Children, censuses, stories passed down in fragments. Oral history says that she may have been at least half Native American, that she came to Fannin County straight from the reservation with her family, possibly stepfamily, as a seasonal laborer. My grandmother said she came to Texas to pick cotton. And what we do know is this: by 1900s, she and Charlie were together and already had a son. But they weren't married until after their son was conceived. The dates are way too close and the math doesn't work out for me. So either the baby came first or they were living together in secret. And in 1900, in rural Texas, guys, this entire story is one that would raise eyebrows. So maybe Charlie kept himself listed in his father's household on purpose. Maybe he was trying to maintain an image or avoid one. Maybe that dual data entry in the census was less about confusion and more about control. Whatever the reason, by 1905, the situation had changed. Charlie's grandfather, the Reverend, had died. The last anchor to Bonham was gone. And that's when Charlie and Henrietta packed up and left. They headed south to Houston County, Texas, together but with secrets already trailing behind them. And what happens next? Well, this is where the fun begins. When Charlie's grandfather, Reverend Robert Henderson, died in 1900, something shifted. It wasn't just the loss of a man, it was probably the loss of the only stable home Charlie had ever known, because by then, Charlie wasn't drifting. The census shows he was the head of a household in Fannin County, married, settled, and this is important. He owned his home. Not a farm, just a house, but it was his. That small detail tells a bigger story. The house may have stood on family land, maybe part of what the Reverend had left behind. But after the old man died, after probate did what probate always does, and I haven't found evidence of this, but maybe that house just didn't feel like home anymore. Maybe Fannin County felt empty. We know he still had family there. Who knows? But once the paperwork went through, sometime between 1900 and 1905, Charlie and Henrietta left Fannin County for good. And they didn't go far. Just far enough to disappear. They moved to Houston County near a place called Ratcliffe. If you've never heard of it, well, that's okay. Most haven't. But at the turn of the 20th century, Ratcliffe was booming. No, not from oil, not from cattle, not from any of the things that you stereotypically think of when you hear the word Texas. At the tail end of the Old West, as the West was fading into history, Charlie still carried a gun. And he worked in the lumber industry. That's right. Ratcliffe was a huge central hub for lumber. This was pine country. Tall, straight trees with thick trunks full of resin, perfect for cutting and shipping. There were sawmills, rail lines, logging camps. And Charlie, well, according to the 1910 census, he worked right in the middle of it, at a sawmill near Ratcliffe. Back-breaking work. Loud, dangerous, but steady. And the industry in that area grew so much that they cut down just about every tree, and the industry in that area collapsed by 1930. My own grandfather, Charlie's son, would grow up here, be born here, and he too would work in the lumber industry in the 20s and 30s. This is where my father would be born, in a logging camp in the same section of Texas between there and Houston. And that's where he would grow up. It's where my grandparents would meet. So back to Grandpa Charlie. Maybe he wasn't running from something. Maybe he was just trying to start over. He had a wife, children. He rented a house, no land, no farm, just a laborer in a sawmill. But maybe that was enough for a little while. But as you know by now, the stories didn't stop. There were whispers of gambling, of cheating, of Charlie bringing home bags of money, then watching Henrietta burn it. There were stories of debts and of men who don't forget. And then around 1912, Charlie vanished. Why 1912? Well, that's a story for a different podcast. I recently learned of that date, but it doesn't fit into my tale just yet, except to say that it was around 1912 that Charlie vanished. The family was told he had died in a railroad accident, fell under a train are the words my grandmother used. But there was no death certificate, no grave, just silence. And for a long time, that silence was treated as truth. But Henrietta, she didn't wait around in mourning. She remarried, had one more son, and she moved on, at least outwardly. She raised Charlie's children along with her new family, and if she knew more than she told, she took most of it with her. Still, those whispers never really went away, because even decades later, the trail wasn't cold. A lawyer contacted Charlie's oldest living son, but not in 1912. No, it was years, decades later. The lawyers wanted to discuss Charlie Henderson's estate, saying that Charlie had just recently died. Which raises the question, if Charlie died under a train, why was someone looking for his heirs? That's it for this episode of Finding Grandpa Charlie. In this episode, we traced Charlie's steps from childhood on the move to a quiet home in Bonham, a place he may have returned to only long enough to fall in love, then disappear again. Next time, we follow Charlie and Henrietta to Houston County and explore what really happened in the sawmill towns of East Texas. A mysterious death, a missing body, and a letter that showed up years later, making us all believe that maybe Charlie is still alive. Because if you think the story's just coming to an end, well, you're wrong. Someone started asking questions, and there's a lot more. So thanks for listening. And if you're enjoying the show, please consider leaving a review or a comment, sharing it with someone who loves a good family mystery. This is Erv Lenzy, and I'll see you in the next episode.